Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the possibility to present some of our thoughts here around the role of emotions, the interplay with simulation. I'm Peter Dieckmann. I'm work and organizational psychologist. I work as a main job in the Copenhagen Academy for Medical Education, the big simulation center a little bit outside of Copenhagen. I'm also an adjunct professor with the University in Stavanger and an associate professor with the University in Copenhagen. My interests lie in the connection between patient safety and healthcare education. And I would like to explore this topic a little bit with you today, looking into emotions and simulation. Why would we look at this? Why would we look at emotions? And then also a little bit of a how. I don't have a big toolbox that you can use, kind of ask this question, and then you know everything about the emotion of a person. The how element will be more like some overarching principles and themes. And I hope that you kind of find your way then to actually put that into practice by, for example, asking questions, by listening to answers, by observing people in a different way. I think this is a lot about a mindset and also about techniques and so on, but that would be a different talk. And I think it's also something that you would need to practice. So I will concentrate a little bit more on the why is this important, and then the overarching how could that work. Stepping back a little bit, so kind of looking into the healthcare system, we have a situation where we have the patient and their relatives, and we have a whole bunch of people actually involved in the care of these people. You are most likely within the bunch here that I call the healthcare professionals. But there's also other people who put your framework conditions up, the politicians, the organization, the administrators, leaders, and so on. But you also work with support staff like allied health, cleaning personnel. All different people need to work together to actually make a difference for patients. Then there's an organization involved and different departments, different traditions, norms, values, beliefs. There's an interplay with the technology as well. You use some tools, some devices. Some of them are very helpful for doing your job. Some of them are maybe not so helpful. They might struggle a little bit to use them. In the end, it's kind of this interplay between human technology and organization. My assumption is that in the moment when we look quite a bit at the human and sometimes forget a little bit like technology and organization. But when we look at the human, it's very specifically kind of from a cognitive aspect. You need to learn something, you need to know many things, you need to be able to do many things and so on. But I would like to enlarge our view of the thinking here. In principle, we should also look more at the interplay with the technology and organization. That is, again, a different talk. But I would like to focus on different aspects of the human being, basically, in this talk, the emotions. I'm not alone in this. When you look into the CANMED's roles model, which many of you may be familiar with, and maybe you actually also use it, the idea is that as a healthcare professional, it's principally made for physicians, but I think equally also applies to other healthcare professionals. You have kind of the medical expert in the middle, and then different roles around that, the communicator, collaborator, leader, healthcare advocate, scholar, professional. When you look into the description of each of these roles, there's quite a bit of a description for each of them. I'm going into the professional role. Here's a little bit of an overview. I don't expect you to read that. I marked the one that I'm interested in here more. So it's also recognized that to provide optimal patient care, physicians must take responsibility for their own health and well-being and that of their colleagues. So in principle, already here on the level of these guiding frameworks, you find that the well-being, and I think here the emotions can probably be seen as part of the well-being of myself as a healthcare professional and my colleagues as relevant. When we look at this from the philosophical side, Herbert Simon wrote, hence in order to have anything like a complete theory of human rationality, we have to understand what role emotions play in it. And these two frameworks here, these two citations, point to the two different directions in which I would like to discuss emotions. If I go back here to the Kahneman's rule, it's kind of the well-being to keep physicians, to keep healthcare professionals safe and healthy enough so that they actually can perform their work. You could also say it's a value in itself to keep you guys healthy. Herbert Simon kind of points a little bit in a different direction. If we want to understand what humans, and with that also healthcare professionals do, we need to also understand the role that emotions play in it. So this notion here that Simon has is not so much about taking care of people. He probably also would agree to that. It's not part of this citation here. This citation is kind of, we want to understand what people are doing. We also need to consider their emotions. It's not only what you think, but also what you feel and so on. And maybe this distinction between cognition and emotion is not so realistic, basically. We could trace that back, or somebody, I can't, into the philosophical foundations of where got the mind basically separated from the emotions. So two different directions that I would like to explore. The one with the Kahneman's acute, chronic emotions, moods, current states, and the relation to the well-being of and health of healthcare professionals. The other direction is to look at emotions as action guiding, action regulating element. I would actually like to focus more in this talk on the action regulation part. But let's have a quick look at this side here of the well-being of healthcare professionals. And here I draw quite a bit on the experiences from conversations in clinical practice that I had the honor and burden, no, honor, pleasure is the wrong word, honor, to do in different hospitals here in relation to the COVID-19 crisis, where I spoke to around, 70 healthcare professionals in some kind of a debriefing, basically. And they described that there's so much strain from the crisis here in terms of the disease itself, unclear how to treat it, can ourselves get infected by this. The workload, kind of many different tasks, suddenly patients filling up the wards, no time to breathe actually. And then also the social complexity in this, that people had to work with new colleagues quite a bit. These pop-up intensive care units that kind of created different organizational structures so that sometimes people needed to get to know new people all the time. Every second week, you just got somebody to know somebody, and then they had to move on to a different department and so on. So many kind of complexities in this. And then limits also on the possibility to help. They knew the people that I would usually ask for help, they might also be busy. So a lot of strain from these different sources, and experienced from their side quite little support from leaders because they were busy organizing things, from colleagues because they were busy treating patients, from families because they might not actually grasp some of the burdens that you as healthcare professionals are under. Some of you might talk with your families. Many say that's not the right target group for me to help around these professional issues. And I think the COVID-19 crisis just points to the tip of the iceberg. I think this is relevant for every day of your clinical work. We are running a project in the moment where we try to establish helpful conversation on a peer-to-peer basis around these emotional challenge that you experience all the time, basically. So we could explore that in more detail. I switch over to this action regulation element of emotions. How could we approach that? So one thing is that emotions kind of guide what we are doing. Negative emotion might actually keep us away from things that we are fearing. And if you have a spider, if you're spider phobic, then close your eyes for a moment. So We tend to react to spiders quite strongly. Many of us, I do. I involuntarily kind of, where's the spider, I jump, even though I think that's stupid with the spiders that we have in Denmark. We are much less afraid of, and I actually hope it transports here, of these fancy sport cars. We're actually quite attracted, many of us, to these fancy sport cars. And not only on the immediate level, but also on the higher climate change kind of level, sports cars are much more dangerous than spiders are. But still, our system needs to adjust to that. So two messages here. One, our emotions push us away from some things, spiders, attract us to others, nice cars. That's the one thing. The other thing is that sometimes it's very different, our immediate reaction versus the reaction that we actually get when we think about things. That is represented by, in this model here, by Dieckmann, that he, together with Amos Tversky, kind of over decades of work, they have developed this model basically. Where Kahneman describes the system 1 and system 2 kind of apparatus that we have as humans. So system 1, fast, autonomic, frequent, emotional, stereotypical, unconscious, our immediate gut feeling reactions to something. And this is very strong. You can basically not really influence it so easily. That is what where your life history is, and kind of puts you into certain states, for example, and also colors quite a bit that even if you put on your slower, effortful, infrequent, logical, calculating, conscious system 2, it's sometimes, kind of influenced or often influenced by the system 1 kind of immediate responses. When we work with emotions in simulation, I think would be interesting, necessary to explore both reactions. So I think also, for example, when you're working with coworkers, if you look at teamwork and emotions in simulation, how do you actually deal with somebody that you have an immediate negative reaction to, but you still know that we have to work with each other, for example? How do we actually do that? What is the professionality in this here? How do you convince yourself that it's worth to work with this person here? We look also into the brain, and I don't go into the detail. I'm also not an expert in this, but in principle, kind of two systems here, whether the higher up, do you involve your frontal cortex or not? Where is the emotion process? Do you also find physiological correlates for these two kind of systems here? My point here would be, if you would say, kind of as an analogy, to say not considering emotions in the analysis and the intervention on human action is like basically not considering AB and the ABCDE approach to critically ill patients, which I assume you are familiar with. And I specifically say A and B because system 1 type of thinking, this is where the emotions sit. And of the whole foundation of our decision making, of our thinking, and so on, we would not consider if we don't consider emotions. How can we do that? So I would like to kind of sharpen your perception a little bit, how you could deal with emotions, kind of a little bit on the way of how could you use it in simulation. So emotion basically have 3 elements. The experience, this is what the individual actually feels. This is what we then call anger, fear, happiness, despair, whatever the emotions that you have. And I come back to that sometimes it's not easy to actually find the right label for our emotions. Then there's physiological reactions to emotions, how your body reacts. Do you get a faster heartbeat or not? Blood pressure, cold hands, warm hands, whatever, the physiological changes in their body. And then there's the expression of how you show your emotion or also not show the emotion. Think of different national cultures, traditions. In some countries, you, for many different reasons, would express emotions much more than in other countries. Living in Scandinavia, we are probably here on the less expressive side of emotions. Maybe that's only a stereotype, but there might be actually differences here. And there's different theories around how physiology and emotions play together. One theory basically says you feel the changes in your body and then you put a label on that. Or the other way around, you kind of know that you should be frightened now, and then your body reacts. So it's quite of an open debate, kind of contradictory models here. What is the sequence in this? That is maybe for a different talk again. But it's actually quite interesting. So what is the interplay between the experience and the physiology, for example? When we look into the expression of emotions, especially around this issue, the verbal aspects is only a small part of this, right? The non-verbal cues are very important. And again, as healthcare educator, as simulation person, I think we should actually familiarize ourselves quite a bit with these non-verbal action elements of communication. And when I saw this table, I actually thought, yes, I mean, I can relate to all of them, but they were not very conscious in my mind, for example. So the proxemics, how close do you get to somebody? Is there like a fight? People would tend to invade personal spaces, for example. How much do you also want to keep distance to other persons to support psychological safety in the debriefing? How do people want to sit, for example? Some people say, I want to have a table in a debriefing where I can hide behind. Other ones to have like an open circle. That has something to do with how close we want to get to each other and how much we want to hide behind objects, for example. What is our body appearance? How many tattoos of what kind do you have? How do you wear your hair, your clothes, all these kind of things also communicate often how people are feeling and what kind of mood they are. Our body positioning, our movements. Do people wave their hands like I do? All the time when I talk, I cannot talk without my hands, basically. What gestures do we have? What facial expressions? This issue of micro expressions, where you often see, this is what the person actually feels, and this is then what the person said like half a second later. That sometimes you see that in the television when they look at politicians, where they kind of freeze or show in slow motion facial expressions, for example, of people. And then paralanguage is like, what kind of tone do you have in your voice? How much do you pronounce? Did you get that now? Kind of transport quite a bit of an emotion as well. And we are super sensitive to all these kind of non-verbal communicators, as the table calls them here. So if you look into emotions, it has something to do with adaptations. And I'm a very big fan of adaptations because I think one of our human ability is to adapt to different situations. Part of your healthcare expertise, I would argue, is to adapt the state of the art. You need to know that, whatever you feel this, and then you adapt it to this patient in this situation. And emotions play a role in this on the intrapersonal level, interpersonal level, and the social cultural level. And let's look at each of them in more detail. The intrapersonal level. So kind of system one, quick, immediate actions are basically easier possible when you go with your emotions. You don't have to think a long time, you just follow your instincts, your gut feeling, and so on, and you know what to do. Emotions can also help you to achieve long-term goals. So our anticipation, very important in this. So for those of you maybe involved in a PhD in the moment, this anticipation, when you then finally get the certificate and you anticipate, how strong you will be happy that day, is quite a big motivator when you got the reviews for your paper back, and reviewer 2 asks you to do strange things and you're really frustrated because you thought you explained everything very well and have to rework your paper, for example. So emotions can keep up our motivations. They prepare our body to react, fight, flight, freeze emotions. When you really get angry, your body tenses and so on, the adrenaline is pumping, you don't feel the pain and so on. You might actually go into fights that you know you shouldn't maybe take, for example. And then there's the influences on thoughts, or the other way around. Kind of, as I said before, what comes first, the bodily reaction or kind of the cognitive label that we give. In the context here of healthcare, I think it's quite interesting to look into who do you trust, believe of your colleagues. Think about people that you like. Think about the people that you dislike, and how much does that correlate with how much you actually believe in their professional judgment, for example. So it has an influence, the emotion, on you, your cognitive processes, your decision making, the actions that you take. On the interpersonal level, then emotions often trigger reaction by others. And again, immediate analytical. What would you do immediately if you see this person here? You might have the tendency to go there and actually pat the person on the back here, or on the head, say, what's wrong with you? Might also be that you say, what is actually wrong with this person? Is this maybe a drunk person and we want to create some trouble here? Kind of feel, experience, how would you immediately react to a person? What is the analytical point of view then? And all of this is kind of triggered by our previous experience, but the emotion would trigger tendencies to do certain actions. That is also important here, why they would relate to adaptations. And then, sorry, I didn't translate something here completely from Danish to English. The cultural element. I thought that was actually quite interesting. So we live in a very complex world, physically speaking, chemically speaking, and also socially speaking. We cannot handle all this complexity, so we need some order. Social order is one way of reducing this complexity. If I know who's in charge, I don't have to consider that I'm in charge now if there's another person in charge, for example. So culture as basically a system to sort this social order. We have certain signs, we have certain rules, norms, values, traditions that kind of are organized in a system and guide the individual members of a culture. There's also then the norms regarding the emotions, how much emotions do we express, and so on. When the verbal and non-verbal reactions kind of match what is agreed upon, the feedback loop here via socially appropriate behavior, that basically decreases social complexity. You know what the situation about, you know what to expect of another person, and so on. And as we live in groups, we kind of always have like the increase of social complexity. So the role of emotions and kind of the expression of emotions would actually help on a cultural level to organize the complexity of our being together with each other, which I think is actually quite interesting and might also be interesting, for example, to analyze with a debriefing team, with a simulation team, what is our culture guiding elements here around our emotions and so on. Would also be interesting to ask your participants in their actual practice. I said earlier, sometimes it's not so easy to actually think about emotions. I think also some of them are more approved than others, apropos cultural context. So in many contexts, kind of being, what is it, annoyed or gloomy, depressed might be less valued than being happy, for example. So we attach also, our cultures attach certain values to emotions. It would be interesting to kind of see, in this quadrant here, where is it? Is it these two dimensions, intense versus mild or less intense emotions, and pleasant, unpleasant, to kind of also think with your participants which emotion is involved and to what degrees are they there. Also would be interesting to see kind of what kind of emotional words do you use in your debriefings, if you do that at all. What emotional words would your participants use? All of this, I think, is for me an argument to lift emotions from the personal space to the professional space. My assumption is based on the conversations that I talked about and the clinical practice and many others, is that in the moment, dealing with emotions, whether it's in the sense of keeping yourself healthy as a healthcare professional, or whether it's in the sense of looking at the action guiding element, you have to find in most systems your own way around this. Some of the strategies are less helpful, drinking too much, taking drugs, whatever, to suicidal aspects, to chronic stress, whatever. And I think it would be very important to lift it from the personal space where you, if you're lucky, you find somebody who helps you to deal with these. But if you're unlucky, you have to find your own way, as I said before. So I think lifting it in the professional space would mean to really take that serious, what's already written, for example, in the CANMED's roles framework, and probably in many other frameworks as well, to take the emotions serious, and to start teaching classes around that from pre-graduate and into postgraduate education. How do you work with somebody that you don't like? How do you integrate all these strange situations that you experience? There's at least two givens in healthcare, that you work with emotionally challenging situations, sick people, dying people, and that you work under uncertainty. A lot of the things that you're doing, you don't have the necessary, in principle, necessary foundation in terms of information. You still have to make decisions. With a trauma case, for example, you might not know a lot around this patient, but you still have to make lots of decisions. So if that is given in the situations, I think it would need to become a given that you also learn how to deal with this. How do you deal with these decisions that you had to take with this very sparse information foundation, for example? Your doubts of, did we actually do the right thing, for example? So now I'm kind of shifting a little bit more over to how could you actually do that in simulation. So one thing I think is important, going back to the model that I originally developed in my PhD, where the notion of a course represented by the ellipse here has different parts, and they all need to play together in order to have, for example, the psychological safety that people want to discuss emotions with them. Where you, in the setting introduction, maybe explain why is this important, maybe with a little bit of a variant of the talk that I give to you now. Or Vicky LeBlanc, for example, you might know, maybe you have heard her presentation at the last CISA meeting. I think she had the keynote. She's also a person who kind of looks and much more into details than I do here, into the role of emotions, to get inspired by her, for example, also. But to basically also discuss with participants, why is it important to look at emotions? All this could be part of the setting and the different phases to prepare the discussion. I think you need to do that. As just starting a debriefing with, hey, now let's discuss your emotions. You probably don't get an open reaction because people don't know, why would I open up around this? Looking into a publication that we did in the follow-up of COVID, we kind of try to look into what different roles can simulation play in this context here. And we distinguish three different ways of thinking around this here, the educational focus. And we could maybe use our simulations to teach people around the effects of emotions, the three components, for example, of emotions, the interplay between verbal, non-verbal aspects of emotions, to kind of maybe make that a learning goal. Understand your emotional reaction in a critical situation, or in a very boring situation, or in a situation where the patient doesn't treat you well. The system focus then, what kind of support systems could we actually establish to help people deal with emotions? In Denmark, a colleague, Katja Schröder, she's working with the body study, where you identify somebody who could help you in terms of, in case there's an emotional strain on you, where you could maybe discuss with that person. And then the personal focus, what is your own real emotional first aid, for example, if you are kind of pushed out of your balance, how do you find that back? I think the third focus is probably the one where you really have to consider the most careful, how is your setting appropriate for that? That gets somewhere into the area of therapeutical issues. And probably you also would need to really look into that you know what can you do, what can you not do, but to kind of start helping people reflect on their own emotions and on their own way of dealing with things. People are different, so that is also why I don't have like a toolbox for you where you say do this, do that. Standardized teaching will lead to variable outcomes. People, especially if you talk about emotions, are very different. And a lecture like this will be boring for some will be kind of completely out in the blue. What role does emotions play here and so on? So I think would be really important that we help our facilitators to get a feeling for how far can you go with somebody. So variable teaching to kind of reach standardized outcomes in the sense of that people want to actually discuss emotions here. So a little bit toolbox, what could that be? So in the scenario design, I think we could work with role players, colleagues, patient relatives, who actually potentially can trigger our participants into emotional reactions, being annoyed, being frustrated, being scared, whatever. And I think very important that you have a good debriefing structure for these role players, that you make sure they are okay before they go home, but also that you keep an eye on, how far can you go with your participants. In principle, I think it's about creating tension in the simulation situation, and you need to find out with your own team how much do you dare, because you actually might create these strong emotions. And do you have the time, the space also to kind of explain potentially what you did to help people get out of them? So the different diffusing type of debriefing as well, where you kind of go into the details with this. I think there's a big potential around this to really create these emotions in a debriefing, but we also need to kind of consider carefully how to do that. And again, I unfortunately don't have the recipe in my hand here, and I just want to explain the principles to you. One way I think of dealing with this is that we go through these 4 types of questions here. So what happened in the situation, what feelings were involved, and again, help people to actually identify which feelings were involved. And then to go one step further to look what needs are these feelings an expression for. You can be feeling angry. Are you angry with yourself because you didn't perform some certain step with the patient, or are you angry with your colleague because he or she did say something to you that annoyed you? And the need in both situations would be quite different. The need in the first situation is to really feel, hey, I didn't do something wrong. The need in the second situation might be, I want to be respected by my colleague again. And depending on the need is then and the feelings and the facts is where you then basically would decide what action to take. It's a little bit similar to, for those of you who know Jenny Rudolph's and colleagues' paper with the frame action and result model, the feelings and the needs basically are within the frame box here. Let's look a little bit at the needs in more detail. I work with a model that has these 6 different basic human needs. And I say all people are equal because we all have these human needs. There might be other models with different number of them, but emotionality, safety, freedom, and so on. Now, I already said people are different, and we could maybe express that by saying, yes, we are all equal in that we have such needs, but we have them to a different extent. And we could maybe represent that with the size of the containers. And the containers can also be filled to a different degree. So this person doesn't need any more freedom. This person needs acceptance. So if we want to work with also simulation and bring people to relevant learning experience, where are they? What kind of need do they have? And do you want, do you have the energy and the framework and the commission to actually work with these needs? So if somebody is really, really, really insecure, you might actually not have the space in a debriefing to really work with this, but you might raise that as an issue and suggest somebody to get some counseling, for example, support kind of in the background. So emotions, to develop your senses for where is somebody, can they work with you in the moment? What is the needs? What would be actions to actually fulfill their needs? Sometimes we give good tips and tricks and so on, and they solve a problem that nobody has. So because we didn't really understand the actual need of the other person. Way also to work with this is to kind of become aware of our inner voices. The little devil and the little angel you probably all can relate to, whatever that is. Friday evening, should you go for a sport activity or sit on the couch or whatever your inner voices are, with the little angel and the little devil. And there's not only right or wrong in our worlds, but we all have like our inner team. And what I've written here is just examples. We have maybe the helper, the inquisitor, and so on. And some participants might trigger different parts of us. This participant triggers our helper here. Another participant maybe triggers our inquisitor. And we kind of, want to tease out things with the other person. And the more our inquisitor comes out, maybe the other person brings out the king. And then suddenly we get into these conflicts where they are not really explainable by the subject matter, but basically by our emotions. And to become very aware of that, difficulty briefings, you trigger this kind of feeling in me, and I would like to probably trigger some other feelings in you that could potentially be a basis to really solve a conflict that you might have with somebody, whether it's in teaching situation or in clinical work. So it would be quite interesting to think for yourself what sentences come to my mind in certain situations. If I'm, for example, in conflict with somebody, I need to win this. You should not look weak, for example, could be sentences. And then to consider what is the name of the role saying this sentence. So the honorable might say, don't lose. And they basically, together, the sentences would point you into the direction of the feelings. The name would point you into the direction of the needs. Both of them would be it's not easy, but quite powerful reflection tools around your emotions. In practical terms, you often have people with different hierarchy in a group, and often you have kind of the people with the many stars on the shoulder. They say it's great. And then they kind of define that also for the other persons, who then also have to say it's great, even that they maybe not be feeling this way. I think for a debriefing, for example, it would be quite interesting to specifically also ask the people low in the hierarchy, maybe first, how did you see the situation? Did you feel comfortable, for example? To summarize all of this, kind of, if you want to make that happen, I think we need to think in 3 different layers here. Our facilitators probably need to accept that this is a relevant element. They need to have the tools and insights into kind of working with this. And the willingness also to potentially get into rough waters if people actually discuss emotions. In terms of the concept, we need to also develop, I think, concrete questions, concrete techniques of working with the emotions, much more than I kind of highlight here on this principle talk. And then also in the organization, I think it's quite interesting that we actually plan enough time, then reduce maybe the number of learning goals, that we actually have the possibility to really work with these issues. All of this needs to play together. Finally, one more time, why is this important? So speak up situations. For example, we are all social creatures. We try to avoid the situation on my right here, where we are the only person outside of the group. Many dilemmas that an individual has in a team, and you might not bring up a challenge because you fear that you're the only person outside. If you look at this from the patient's perspective, and let's call the patient Esther here, in many circumstances, in the eyes of Esther, our conflicts, our doubts, and so on, or that healthcare professionals have, is not really relevant. If you don't dare to speak up around the hygiene issue, for example, that your colleague is doing, with Esther's eyes, I would, hope you do find the courage to speak up. So when we work around this in debriefings, also to try to help people see, if you look at the situation with, the emotions with your direct colleague involved, you would come to a certain decision. But if you look at your emotion, at the conflict, for example, that you have with the colleagues from the outside, with Esther's eyes, it might actually look quite different. And I think we could, in debriefings, consciously switch the frame of reference. So for you, it's uncomfortable in the moment, but would it still be worth doing because it would be important for Esther? And to kind of discuss with people when you actually look into these action guiding potential that emotion have, from which direction do we look at this? From your own, you might come to a certain decision. From Esther's perspective, you might come to a different decision. I think that would be also a way of, for example, interacting in debriefings, looking at these emotions and the action guiding functions from different angles. That was quite a bit of an overview here, the different ways of emotions kind of with the focus of keeping you as healthcare professionals safe and healthy, and then the action guiding elements around emotions. And I hope you found that useful. I talked a lot, I talked fast. Thank you very much for your attention. And I hope to see you for some live questions. Bye-bye.